for inviting me back. You had me on your podcast some time back, and I'm sorry we haven't timed this perfectly. I believe quite a lot of your colleagues are out in the pubs before they shut. I'll make comments on three things. Basically, what's happening in America, some of the trends in UK politics, and the subject I've just written a book about, which is the new Cold War and China. So I'll say a few minutes on each of those, and I'll be drawing on what I'm doing at the moment. I mean, I have my political history as a party leader and in the cabinet, but I'm currently doing quite a lot of work at the LSE in Nottingham with students and researching. And I'm doing a lot of writing weekly for The Independent and a series of books. But first of all, in terms of what's happened today, my understanding is that if the provisional counts are right in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nevada, Biden just gets to 270. But if he's to have real authority, he will need to win Pennsylvania as well. And there's an interesting bit of mental arithmetic, I think, that if he gets over 75% of the remaining 25% of uncounted votes, which I think he's currently doing, he just gets over the line and would have a decisive result. But there are all kinds of problems which are going to flow from this. And I had an article in The Independent a week ago going over some of these scenarios. And there are essentially three. I mean, one is Trump goes to the courts. And as we know, the courts, particularly the higher courts, are highly politicized in America. And it's just possible he may get the Supreme Court either to stop the counting or to reverse a result in a particular state, which could be crucial. I think secondly, and more worryingly and plausibly, is that he simply refuses to go. I mean, he will denounce the result as a fraud. And there may be a lot of trouble on the streets. I mean, he's got a lot of supporters who are very charged up. A lot of them are armed. We could have trouble in American cities. He then declares a state of emergency and effectively stays in power. It sounds a bit, thriller-like rather than real world, but I can see that playing out. But I think probably the most likely outcome is that he does lose and he does go. But he's got a sort of toxic legacy. I mean, he isn't going to go away. He will have access to his social media and to all kind of radio and television shows to get his views across. He's got, tens of millions of fanatical supporters who will be waiting to see his latest tweet, who are embittered, feel they've been cheated, who will be hopelessly alienated from the Democratic administration if we get one. So it's a very divided country, and I feel weakened, and it will be very difficult for Biden to run the country effectively, particularly if he doesn't win the Senate. It doesn't look as if he is. So I think all kind of problems ahead in the United States, whatever happens in the counting. Second, just say a little bit about UK politics. It's dominated by a series of uncertainties. I think one is how the public react to COVID. What's quite interesting so far is that although Britain isn't exactly a shining success story in terms of managing the pandemic, the public view appears to be, well, they're doing their best and couldn't really do any better. And I think they've been given a certain amount of support by the fact that the French and the Germans have gone for some form of lockdown. I'm personally highly skeptical about the value of the lockdown. I'm not sure it's necessary or that it will achieve its objectives. I rather sympathize with Theresa May, who apparently you've just told me spoke up on this subject in Parliament, very much on her side on this particular one. The other issue which could change opinions in the UK is the fallout from Brexit. This is the other big shock coming around in 6 weeks' time, 7 weeks' time. It's very clear that British business isn't ready, even if there is an agreement, and I think probably on balance there will be a thin agreement. British companies haven't prepared all the paperwork required for border controls. there will be very serious disruption, I fear, in the transport sector and to some of our manufacturing industries, and quite a lot of harm will be done. I say, even if we get an agreement, let alone if we have a no deal, the government will try to maintain its hope that we're going to get all kind of agreements around the world to compensate them. And this was always a fantasy. And if Biden is elected, I mean, the chances of getting a meaningful trade agreement which compete with the European Union are very, very low. He has no motives for doing it. Clearly wants to support the European Union rather than the UK. Is very anti-Brexit, has a strong commitment to United Ireland, or at least to opposing the disruption to the Good Friday Agreement. So they're not going to get anything out of a Biden administration, if that's what we're going to get. So we're not going to get compensating trade agreements. What the British government is angling to do, which is quite interesting politically, though probably economically of no substance, is joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It sounds rather bizarre that Britain will classify itself as being part of Asia, but joining a large group of successful East Asian countries, minus China, would be quite a good move politically. But I think the real game changer in the UK is neither COVID nor Brexit. People have made their minds up on Brexit, and COVID doesn't seem to be shifting people's alignments. I mean, the big thing that I think is coming around the corner is changes in the economy. I mean, we are heading for a very deep slump, large amounts of unemployment, and it coincides with Mr. Sunak adopting a much harder line approach to the budget, which is unfortunate and premature. The IMF is telling developed countries like the UK, which have fiscal space, to continue to spend, to support demand and to deal with hardship. But we've seen with the free school meal issue for children, the Rashford Initiative, that the Treasury is now becoming much harder. I think to get us through the economic crisis which is coming, we're going to need a very big, expansive program of public works, generous welfare benefits, universal credit, help 3 million plus people who are out of work and their families. And I sense this isn't coming because the Treasury is no longer willing to write the checks. And I think, early in the new year, we may see public mood souring on the Chancellor and on the government if they are unable to maintain the relative optimism about economic policy which has survived so far. Just a final point about UK politics. I mean, we don't have a general election for 4 years, but the Labour Party under Starmer, it seems to me, is doing all the right things. They're positioning themselves correctly for a revival. And I think a combination of a reformed, revived Labour Party and the Lib Dems in parts of the country where my party is strong could potentially offer a challenge at the next election. That's a long time away, and we've got several rounds of local government elections that will tell us where we're heading. And just my third and final comments are on the subject that I've just written short book about, which is the Cold War. I chose this as a topic because my own recollections of Cambridge, which are many years ago, was overshadowed by an almost hot war. The early 1960s was the period when the old Cold War with the Soviet Union almost got out of control. And I think, I was one of the student population who were generally terrified that the Cuban Missile Crisis would spin out of control. We're not in that situation with China, but the stakes are escalating, the hostilities are escalating. At the moment, the competition is largely economic, and I think the point's probably not sufficiently appreciated in the West is the extent to which China is not just now very big on a purchasing power parity measure. Its GDP is bigger than the United States, but that's one measure. It's certainly very big. The key point, I think, is that it is proving to be highly successful. Unlike the former Soviet Union, that had a lot of weapons and was very aggressive with the threat of intervention and so on. China's strength is economic. They're managing their economy very skillfully. They're climbing out of the pandemic faster than the West. They're engaged in a technological competition with the West, appear to be doing it very successfully, mobilizing resources around AI, rapidly substituting technology that the Americans are now trying to cut off. And they've developed a very successful model of state capitalism. Although it's called a communist country, it's actually a capitalist country, but with lots of state backing. And I think we're underestimating the extent to which China isn't just big, but very, very successful. And if the American presidential election turns out badly, they will also offer themselves as a role model about how you achieve political stability without all this democratic nonsense. Now, where is all this heading? At the moment, there is a lot of technological competition to the United States. We've got sanctions being imposed to try to stop the Chinese developing super semiconductors. The Chinese are probably ahead in 5G, though the Americans are trying to cripple that with Huawei. You've seen, or you may have seen today, the problems associated with ants. What was going to be the world's biggest share issue has had to be pulled at the last moment because the Chinese government trying to impose political will on one of their leading companies. I think this is part of this maneuvering around the new Cold War. I mean, the big question confronting President Biden, if that's what we get, he's in quite a dilemma. I mean, does he continue the confrontation with China, trying to build an alliance of like-minded countries? He's probably better able to do that with Trump, with India, Australia, Taiwan, Korea, Japan to some extent. So that's what we may see. But on the other hand, he needs Chinese cooperation on climate change above all, but a whole lot of other global problems associated with the World Trade Organization, pandemic control, managing the economic disaster in Africa, and various other things. So there will be a balance to be struck between confrontation with China and trying to engage with them. You know, my book is essentially an argument for engagement, but there is a difficult trade-off. Anyway, those are three issues I'm tossing out to your little group, but, you know, far ahead with any questions which interest you.
All right, thanks very much for that introduction, Vince. I guess we'll start with lockdown. Now, you've said that you're a skeptic of the new lockdown measures, and you've written about this in The Independent as well. But perhaps it's easy to be critical of the government while not really suggesting an alternative. If you were in government, what would you do right now?
No, I'm not attacking the government. I think they're probably acting in good faith. And for Johnson personally, I think having to eat a lot of humble pie and do a U-turn was probably very difficult. And I applaud his willingness to do that. And he thinks he's following scientific evidence. My skepticism is that the group of scientists who are extremely eminent, and we should, of course, respect that, are not qualified to deal with trade-offs in terms of the economic costs, in terms of the collateral damage. And I've not seen any evidence to suggest that it makes sense to move away from the tiered approach, which is concentrating different levels of lockdown according to the severity of the regional problem. The Scots, who have been, faithfully following scientific advice north of the border, have kept that approach. I mean, science isn't different in Scotland. I mean, it's just the same scientific knowledge. So why are they going for a more differentiated approach, and the English, the British government, going for this national lockdown, which imposes the same restrictions whether you're in little villages in Suffolk or in the middle of Liverpool? So I'm highly skeptical. So the question is, what would I do? I would be concentrating overwhelmingly on the test and trace, because we know from East Asia that that's the thing that counts. I'd get rid of the management, I'd get rid of the private contractors, I'd shift this down to local public health authorities. I would, invest a lot of resource trying to get the testing system running. But the crucial thing is trace. Nobody's going to own up to being infected or split on their friends and tell them that tell the authorities their friends are infected, if it's going to mean losing your job or losing a large amount of income without any compensation or proper compensation. So there has to be a really generous welfare package, and that means reforming the universal credit system, sickness pay, things of that kind. And then you may get people cooperating, as they do in Japan and other countries which have really got on top of it. And I would add to that, for old fogies like me, who are supposed to be vulnerable, and maybe we are, help in shielding, so that we can keep out of the way, and we have access to food and the other necessities of life.
What have you made of things like the Great Barrington Declaration signed by Sinatra Gupta and Carl Hennigan even?
Well, I'm not challenging the government's judgments on ideological grounds. Or the Barrington Declaration seemed to be a kind of fundamentally different approach. I mean, I'm happy to accept the conventional science. I think the issue is about different ways of dealing with it. Let me just give an example. I mean, the Swedish model is often cited as an alternative, but of course Sweden is quite nuanced, and they do rely on voluntary social distancing. They have a certain amount of regulation. And with Asian countries like Japan, they haven't had the severe lockdowns we have. They're not allowed to under their constitution. And they rely on voluntary compliance and subtle ways of dealing with it. So I'm not challenging the science, and I'm saying even if we accept the science, there are better ways of managing this.
I'd like you to situate this moment in history. How significant is it? Is it more significant than 2008? Is it the most serious crisis we faced since the Second World War?
Yes, I think the answer is yes, for several reasons. First of all, it's global. I mean, the financial crisis, which I was involved in both commentating on and then trying to deal with the response in government, we thought of as the worst crisis since the Second World War. But actually, it was limited to a relatively small number of developed countries. It didn't affect China. It didn't affect India. And the world economy kept growing. And if you look at the context, the financial crisis took out about 5% of the British economy in 1 year. And that compares with, say, the Great Depression in the United States, which took out 30% of the American economy in 1 year before Roosevelt came into power. So in that kind of mega league, it was a relative blip, but quite a painful one while it lasted. The financial crisis has done long-term damage to people's incomes. We're a poorer country because of it, but it wasn't that kind of mega event. It wasn't global. The economic damage is much bigger. The whole world economy is going to contract this year. It's going to drag 70, 80, 100 million people back into absolute poverty, and particularly in India, where the crisis has been horribly mismanaged and is causing a big economic contraction. A lot of African countries where lockdowns are doing more damage than the disease. No, it is on a global level a terrible crisis in economic terms, and it's also changing the politics. I mean, what we're seeing, particularly with the success of China and to some extent Vietnam, is a vindication of a more authoritarian style of government. Of course, it doesn't have to be. Korea and Japan and Taiwan are not authoritarian, but it is giving a boost to the Chinese way of running the world. And, in that sense, it's also highly significant.
All right, let's move on to the Liberal Democrats. You've got a new leader in Ed Davey. What do you think it's going to take to rejuvenate the party from the election in 2019?
Well, Ed was a colleague of mine in government. He's a good man and very sensible and very competent, and I'm sure he will improve the situation. I think just reeling back a little bit to see where we got into this very bad position. I mean, just over a year ago, I was leader at the time, the party was in a very good position. We just had sweeping gains in local elections. We had sweeping gains in European elections. We were about 20% in the polls. And it all went. Now, it went partly for structural reasons that were not the fault of the parties. The Brexit vote was split. We have this traditional first past the post problem because of the absence of proportional voting. But there were some mistakes made, and I think, the revoke thing turned off a lot of people. And we seriously underperformed. And the question for Ed Davey is how, having fallen down now in 3 successive elections, how do we, have the courage really to sort of clamber to our feet again? It's like being in a heavyweight boxing championship and you've been on the floor 3 times. How do you get up again? I think it will happen in 2 ways. One is gains in local government. Last 2 years we've done very, very well in the south of England. In times past, we have run cities like Liverpool, Newcastle, Sheffield, Hull. We could get back, but the prospects in the big cities are not as good as elsewhere. So local government is the first priority, and we should, with good organisation, make big gains in local government. And the second is, when we approach the next general election, I think we should look to an implicit agreement with the Labour Party. I mean, not an explicit pact. You can't do that. There's no appetite for it with the public or the party, but just an understanding that there are parts of the country, the Winchesters, the Cheltenhams, the outskirts of Manchester and Stockport, where the Lib Dems are very strong, are close second. If we just get on and target those seats, we can probably get 25, 30. The Labour Party are going to do well elsewhere, but they can't form a government, not least because they've lost their base in Scotland. But, a tacit alliance could give not just the Labour Party, but the Lib Dems a route back into serious politics.
And the slogan under your leadership was "Bollocks to Brexit." Would you like to see a rejoin position adopted by the party?
No, not in a very specific sense. I mean, I think ultimately, our future as a country lies in a close relationship with Europe. But I think in 10 years' time, the European Union will look very different from what it is today. And we've got to have an open mind about the kind of relationship we might want to have. I mean, it may be as a kind of super Norway type arrangement. It may be in an outer tier of countries. I mean, we just don't know. So I would argue, as Ed Davey is arguing, for a close relationship with Europe, to position ourselves as a pro-Europe party, but not make very specific commitments on rejoining, because the public have spoken. The general election was decisive, however unreasonable we think the procedure was. It's an old question. There's no point picking at the scabs. Just let the thing settle, let the public form their views about what Brexit has resulted in. And, we can come back to the issue of forming a new relationship with Europe in 5 to 10 years' time.
And how significant are the economic consequences of Brexit going to be when they're combined with the economic consequences of the COVID crisis?
Well, the two things together make a rather unappetizing cocktail. But I've always argued in relation to Brexit that the costs are gradual and cumulative. They're not spectacular. I think to some extent the Remain camp overstated the arguments and over-dramatized them. I think assuming for the moment that we get a reasonably orderly agreement at the end of the year, assuming that, then there'll be some disruption, but we shall just gradually see companies drifting away, some of the supply chains evaporating. Industries like the car industry and aerospace will be hit, but they're not going to close down overnight. I mean, it's a gradual process. So there will be damage, but it will be gradual and it will be seen over time. As I said, 10 minutes ago, I think COVID is going to inflict serious economic damage unless the government is willing to reopen the checkbook as it did earlier this year. And the combination of Brexit and COVID could be rather painful. What the government are clearly positioning themselves to do is to blame any economic damage from Brexit on COVID. Whether the public will fall for that, I don't know, but they're going to try it.
And do you think a return to austerity is the option they're going to take?
Well, I sense there's a bit of that. I don't know how. You get a sense, certainly in the last few weeks, that Sunak, who very much led a kind of expansive approach to fiscal policy 6 months ago, is now, dragging his feet. Is being dragged kicking and screaming into providing the kind of support. Well, we've had a month of extended furlough, but beyond that, the prospects are not good. And, we really do need to have in the next 6 months, year, a very activist government, stimulating recovery. And it's going to pile up quite a lot of debt, but that doesn't matter at current interest rates, and it can be repaid over a long period of time. There's a big difference from the problems we had at the beginning of the last decade, where it wasn't at all clear that we were heading into a low interest world. There was a serious worry that if the British didn't have a plan to work down our exceptional structural deficit, the markets would turn nasty. We would be faced with escalating interest rates, as the southern Eurozone countries had. And it could be very painful. So it is a very, very different economic situation.
All right, let's move on to the Labour Party. So we've seen the publication of the EHRC document on anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn's suspension from the party. Do you think Starmer made the right move in that way?
Yes, I think he's handled that. I don't think he had much choice. Having said categorically, we will accept the report without conditions and just move on. We had Jeremy Corbyn trying to justify himself. He put himself in an impossible position. There is all kind of heated talk about the Labour Party being in a state of civil war. I don't think so. I think it's very much Jeremy Corbyn's own personal problems. I don't know why he has so much problem with this. I knew him for 20 years in Parliament. He was never remotely kind of racist, anti-Semitic at a personal level. He just didn't deal with it properly, and he had a blind spot. And instead of just saying, look, I got this wrong, I'm sorry, let's, it's done a lot of damage, let's just move on and concentrate on what I, Jeremy, think are progressive causes. He's just stuck in a kind of mental block. And I suspect the left of the Labour have been to it. I don't think they're going to fight a civil war on this issue.
And you spoke in your introduction about Starmer and how you've been impressed with him. Is he the next Prime Minister?
I suspect that we may get somebody on the Tory side. Quite apart from likes and dislikes, I do worry a bit about Johnson. He does give me the impression that he's suffering from some kind of long COVID type problem. He's never been the same since his illness. You just look at him carefully. There isn't that self-confidence. He's obviously struggling. He's kept some of his humorous quips, but he's not the man he was, and the people close to him are saying that publicly. And if he continues to sort of flounder, the Tory party are ruthless. I mean, they will get rid of him just as they got rid of Theresa May, and before that, just how they got rid of Margaret Thatcher. You know, iconic figures, and they say your time's up, move on, and they will do the same to him. So it may well be the next prime minister is another Tory. I'm not sure who that will be, though everybody's putting their money on Sunak at the moment.
And let's move on to the climate. We've seen in the Labour Party manifesto 2019 the proposal of a Green New Deal. Do you support that?
Yes, I mean, it's not something you can be against. You know, it's a nice idea that you can combine public investment on incentives to investment with a green tinge. But the question is actually doing it. I mean, I was in government for 5 years, and we tried to have green policies. Some of them are embodied in the Green New Deal, and they're not straightforward. I mean, to give two examples, when Ed Davey was Energy Secretary, we introduced the Green Deal, which was about, you know, retrofitting houses with insulation to, you know, save energy at home, which is a key part of this Green New Deal. And people have forgotten that we tried it. And it was actually quite difficult. Not too many people took it up. They didn't find, elderly people didn't find it particularly attractive. There was a kind of payback, but if you're, you know, 70, 75 and you don't want contractors tramping around the house and you're afraid of being conned by somebody and it's a bit of a hassle, you know, why are you going to do it? The interest rates, thanks to the Treasury, were not attractive. And the scheme never really got going. So having a slogan, you know, Green New Deal, let's retrofit everybody's houses, look back on the program we already had. What I was associated with in government was setting up the Green Investment Bank, and it was a big success. I mean, we got 2 billion from the Treasury, and I think leveraged in another 10, 12 billion from the private sector, which got an awful lot of wind farms launched. I mean, it was a big success, but it wasn't easy, and it didn't operate quickly. I mean, I remember spending a year, more than a year, just getting the thing set up, hiring the right people, getting the headquarters established in Edinburgh, getting good projects. It's not that there are thousands of projects that they're just waiting for money. You know, establishing a wind farm with all the connectivity problems, and other environmental projects, they're not just sitting there waiting for the money. You know, they require project organization, long-term planning, lots of engineers, lots of good managers. So the Green New Deal is a slogan, and it's an attractive slogan, and I sign up to it. But actually doing it is not straightforward.
Okay, I'd like to throw it over to audience members if we could get a few more questions in. But before then, on the topic of the Green New Deal, do you think the COVID crisis makes something like that more possible?
Well, it's become the conventional wisdom to say that, you know, never waste a crisis. I'm not sure. I think it's a bit marginal, to be frank. You know, what people are desperate for will be to get back into work, and it's up to green-minded people in government to try and slant some of the new projects in an environmentally sensible direction, and that does require creative thinking and organization, but it's not going to happen automatically. And I sense this government's heart isn't really in it. I think if Biden is elected, then I think you will see that kind of program. And if he can get the Chinese to cooperate, the Chinese are very two-faced about this. They burn a lot of coal, but they're also very advanced in wind power and solar power. It's not clear which way they're going to go. If they can get this going at a global level, the two big superpowers, then Britain and other European countries are going to be pulled along in the wake, and it will become a dominant strain of economic policy. But it's not going to happen automatically. And I think, to answer your question, the mere fact of us having the COVID epidemic isn't going to give a massive infusion of energy to green policies.
Okay, so Thomas here, I think he's asking about a two-state solution with between Israel and Palestine. Do you see that as possible?
Well, I mean, this is something we've talked about for almost 50 years, and in the initial stages, it looked as if it might, but the Palestinian position has gradually weakened. The Israeli side has been pretty uncompromising, constantly building settlements. It's not clear at the moment if Palestine was given a state by the current Israeli government that it would be sustainable and viable. So sorry to be negative, but it does seem a rather hopeless position from the Palestinian point of view. They got few allies now. Other Arab countries are now signing up for a relationship with Israel. So it's not clear what the two-state solution is going to lead to. I mean, there are people saying, well, look, let's forget about it. It's not going to happen. Let's just concentrate on civil rights for Arabs in Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territories. And that's a different approach. And it may be the way that people should start to think about it.
Okay, so Ellie's put in here, do you think the 2019 UK election and now the 2020 US election has proven the importance of winning over the centre ground of politics?
Well, I'm not sure what the centre ground means anymore. Certainly, I've been in politics for a very long time. I stood for Parliament 30 years before I got in, and then was in for 20 years. So I've been around a while, and it was fairly clear for much of the time what centre ground meant. I mean, it was the centre ground between socialism and free market conservatism. And it was, arguing for a mixed economy and involvement in the trade unions, a tax policy that was a bit fairer without being confiscatory, and so on. I mean, there were, those were the arguments. It's not, politics isn't about that anymore. It's dominated by the politics of identity, about issues around immigration, race, religion, Scottish separatism. I mean, what is the middle ground? I mean, I'm not sure if we're talking about Scotland, what is a middle road position between independence and non-independence? Of course, you can have, compromises on immigration policy, but I think that these very difficult identity issues are quite difficult to reconcile, and that's partly why the United States is so polarized. You've got one, the country is almost literally divided in two, divided with a completely different set of values. And Biden himself is a natural old-fashioned centrist, a bit like me. He comes from that school of thought, but I'm not sure that his skills as a, convener and a compromiser are going to work, because the other side are not listening. They regard him as an interloper and somebody they're fundamentally I was just amazed listening to some of the comments of the electors in the election on the Republican side talking about Biden. There was a very harmless, moderate sort of guy who never done anything dramatic in his life, describing him as dangerous and anti-American. And, when you have that kind of polarization, particularly around issues of identity, I don't know what the central ground is anymore, I'm afraid.
What do you make of phrases such as leveling up?
About leveling up? Well, you mean the issue of the north of England, or bits of the north of England? That it's a good slogan, but it is something that successive governments have been involved in for most of the post-war period, and most regional politics haven't worked. They've made very little difference. It's also a very subtle problem, and it isn't just north versus south. I mean, I come from the north of England, the city of York, which is actually a very successful, diversified city with 2 universities, a lot of tourism, financial services. Harrogate down the road is another prosperous place. And the big cities of Yorkshire, like Leeds, it's doing extremely well. Bradford next door isn't. Sheffield, maybe somewhere between the two. Across the Pennines, Manchester is a fantastic growth centre, Liverpool to a lesser extent, but Oldham and Wigan and Knowsley and these places surrounding the big cities of the north are struggling. And I haven't seen anybody yet who's come up with a convincing answer to that kind of very subtle forms of deprivation. You can inject all kind of energy into the successful bits of the north, but what do you do about the medium-sized towns? I mean, I don't know what the future of Workington is, or Hartlepool. Even if you have a successful development on Teesside and Newcastle, the towns around them are problematic. I mean, I sort of grappled with this issue when I was at the business department, and we set up something called the Regional Growth Fund, which co-finance some very, very good projects in deprived areas of the country, many of them still functioning. But we never really came up with answers to what do you do about the future of Blackpool. It's a classic example of a depressed town based on an industry that no longer exists, catering to Victorian and early Edwardian British tourists. So I think to answer your question, it's an attractive slogan, levelling up. To be sincere in dealing with it, the government will have to tax people in the south very heavily and make big fiscal transfers. But I don't think there's the political will to do it. That's what we should be doing. And that's the one simple policy that would work or make some difference is relatively high taxation in the south, transferring the money to local councils in deprived areas of the country and letting them use their local autonomy to spend it. That might make some difference, but that's a painful political choice I don't think this government are going to tackle.
So we got another question here. This person seems to have read my mind because I was going to ask about this. Do you think HS2 will go ahead?
Well, I think it's now probably past the point of no return. There is a great deal of skepticism on all sides as to whether it was a terribly good decision. But I think you've found this with big projects, that they get to a certain point that the political pain of stopping them is just too much. I mean, an economist would say that this is sunk costs, and you should be looking at future streams of cost and income. But I think in the case of HS2, there's a big political issue here. They've invested so much political capital in it. I mean, I did support it when I was in the cabinet. I mean, I can't escape collective responsibility, but I am rather skeptical. I think that what would work and make a big contribution is if HS2 was started in the north, or at the very least continued. We got the second big branch from Birmingham into Yorkshire and then ultimately up to Scotland, but certainly from Birmingham to Yorkshire and to Manchester, that leg of HS2 has to happen, otherwise it's basically a fraud, I think. My own preference would be, as far as possible, to switch resources from HS2 into HS3 across the north of England, and a network of small-scale rail improvements. But it'd be desirable to have both, but I fear the budget is not going to allow that.
And how do you feel about the next generation of technology, 5G?
Well, I worked extensively with Huawei when I was in government. I thought they were good company. They were involved in some very intimate work with GCHQ. Our security services crawled all over them, found that they could work with them, that there was nothing nefarious in their activities. So I had no problem with Huawei. I could understand why in the moving from 4G to 5G, which has got much more fundamental implications for data management, that we should be careful about admitting them to the inner core of telecommunications activities. And I thought the compromise of Theresa May's government that we should keep and welcome Huawei in many of the telecoms applications and in the more peripheral activities, but exclude them from the inner core. I thought that was a sensible compromise, but the British government allowed themselves to be bullied by the Americans into throwing them out, which I think will set Britain back substantially in 5G development.
Okay, we've got another question. Would a commitment to PR at the next general election be a boost for the Labour Party and the best route to a non-Tory government?
Yes, and I think it has to happen. I mean, I think we made, one of the mistakes we made in the coalition agreement in 2010 is settling for the referendum on the alternative vote that wasn't proper proportional voting. It wasn't AV plus, which is the model that we had been advocated by the Jenkins report. I don't know whether you remember that, but a key development in the Blair government was the commission setting up Roy Jenkins looking at different models, and he recommended AV plus, which is essentially the German system and the system we've now got in Scotland for parliamentary elections. If we demanded that as the price of our participation, then I think in many ways the coalition from a Lib Dem point of view would have been justified, but we settled for a weaker alternative. It was defeated anyway. And we shouldn't get ourselves into the same position again. I think it should be absolute red line that any cooperation next time round demands the adoption of an AV plus system or something like it.
But what do you make of criticisms of the system? So some people say you have proportional representation, you end up with Weimar Germany.
Well, Weimar Germany had all kind of problems, mainly economic problems, with nothing whatever to do with the voting system. I mean, there are different models of proportional voting. You can have an extreme proportionality of the type they have in Holland or Israel, where you have numerous parties. But as I said, I think the German model, which is proportional but eliminates small parties who can't qualify for 5% of the vote, has led to stable government, mostly coalition. Germany is probably on most measures the best, most successfully functioning democracy in the Western world. And other countries in Scandinavia have systems that are not greatly dissimilar from the German model. And Scotland, whatever you think about the Scottish nationalists, they were fairly elected under a proportional system, AV plus, and I think we should, follow that model. And it doesn't lead to extremes. It gives you a much more balanced outcome than we have at the moment. And I think where it's been tried, people have been comfortable with it, and it works.
So in recent weeks, we've seen the stock market's been heavily impacted by the crisis, but house prices are booming at the moment. How do you think the UK government should respond? Should we see a new Help to Buy scheme?
Oh no, Help to Buy is a disaster. I spent quite a lot of political capital in the coalition publicly attacking my colleague George Osborne over the Help to Buy scheme because all that was happening was that it was pumping demand into a market that was already overheated. It was driving up demand and driving up prices. So what was happening was a small number of people were getting access to the housing market, but at the same time, because the price had gone up, an equivalent number of people were being priced out of it. And so we have this extreme and I would say obscene situation now where house prices are just way out of line with people's income. Historically, the ratio roughly of house prices to income averages about 3. I mean, varies a great deal across the country, but a national average about 3. I think it's now up to 8, 9 in places like Cambridge, Oxford, and London. It's 15, 20. I mean, it's just absolutely inconceivable that anybody without wealth can purchase property. And this is now being inflated further because the effect of easy monetary policy is to increase the demand for property. So what do you do about it? Well, first of all, the Bank of England has got to use the discretion it has, so-called macro-prudential policy, to prevent banks pouring money into the housing sector. Secondly, I think we do need to use taxation to make sure that appreciation of property values is taxed, and that we don't create a situation where wealth creation involves buying a house and sitting there and waiting for the price to go up. We want to reward entrepreneurs, not property speculation. And you may need taxation to do that. Capital gains tax plays a role for second houses. And I argued in government and before and after for the extra taxation on high value property, certainly at the top end of the market. Council tax is a pretty regressive tax in relation to wealth, let alone income.
We've got another question here. It's a response to my question on housing. Is part of the solution to rising house prices and declining quality of new builds greater regulation of the building companies?
Well, you do need regulation, amongst other things, to have zero carbon construction. And there already are fairly tight regulatory standards. The problem is they're not enforced because, building departments in local councils have been cut to pieces. There is fairly lax enforcement, but the regulations are there. It's not a question of dreaming new ones up. I mean, I think the big imbalance is that what has happened in the last 20 years, and particularly in the last 10, is since the financial crisis, is that the small builders have largely disappeared. And you've got a handful of very big companies, the Persimmons and Berkeley Homes, which control a lot of land and sit on it, wait for the price to go up and make their money on the margins. And they're raking in money, which you see reflected in their directors' bonuses. And we have a completely impoverished public sector. And this is an area where there really is a bigger role for government or public authorities. I mean, I would want to see much more building by local councils and housing associations. And of course, they would need support from government to do that. But many of them have, certainly councils have land. And there is a phenomenal demand for social housing, which is not met. And that's where the priority should be, I think, rather than through private developers. I think we've got to shift the balance very considerably.
And we're facing another looming deadline with Brexit again. And on the 16th of October, Boris Johnson told the nation to prepare for a no deal. Do you think he's bluffing?
Well, I think he is bluffing, but sometimes it's quite difficult to escape your own bluff. If the European Union call their bluff, then we're stuck with a highly suboptimal outcome. I suspect that if where I started this discussion with the expectation that Biden is going to eventually win, it will be clear that the British government is going to get absolutely no help from the United States on trade or other issues. And that will tip the argument, I think, in favor of the British government adopting a more compromising approach in the last stages. I think the European Union's negotiating position is not stated publicly, but I think is basically to let the British government have a few more fish. And in return, they will happily pocket large chunks of the financial services sector and British manufacturing, which are vastly more valuable. But actually getting to that point and getting people to sign on the dotted line at the right time is not a straightforward exercise. So I think there probably will be an agreement. It will be a very thin agreement. It will be proclaimed as a great triumph for British diplomacy and getting tough with Europe and all that nonsense. But it will actually be very much to our disadvantage.
We're coming to a close, but I'll ask you about the union. Do you see Scotland becoming an independent country? Do you think that's a real possibility?
Well, there is a kind of creeping inevitability to it. I mean, I think if everybody was being rational, it people in Scotland looking at the UK, the fact that most Scots have families in England, the idea of setting up border posts on Hadrian's Wall and to control the flow of goods, and I mean, it sort of makes no sense, and it would be to the disadvantage of Scotland and England. But the problem is that emotionally, Scotland is moving further and further apart. I mean, I started my political life in Glasgow in the Scottish politics, and the culture is very kind of social democratic. It's very alien to the Johnson government. They are instinctively closer to the European Union. They bitterly resent the fact they've been bounced out of it. You've got this problem that Nicola Sturgeon, I think, is a genuinely popular and respected leader, and Johnson isn't. All these things are sort of creating an emotional, almost unstoppable momentum behind an independence that I suspect that when they think about it, people in Scotland wouldn't really want, but that we may get there simply because the British government is so hopeless and alienating.
All right, I think it'd be good to finish on a good note. So, how optimistic are you for the future that things are going to get better?
Well, they're not going to get better for a while. I mean, until this COVID epidemic gets under control and we turn the economic corner. I think there are some positives. There are a lot to be said. In Britain, we still have a strongly democratic culture, unlike the United States, which is quite wobbly. We still have the rule of law, again, not like the United States. We still have quite a rich reservoir of very talented people in the higher education sector and in business. We have a lot of creativity. I think one of the things that excited me when I was in government was the size and the originality of our creative industries. So, I mean, there are lots of things that are good, and with a government that is more consensual, with a politically reformed system, and I think if we got voting reform, we got rid of the House of Lords, more decentralization, Britain could be made a much more attractive place to govern and be governed by. And there are, as I said, quite a lot of economic assets to draw on. So, if I were still around in Parliament, I think I can envisage 5-10 years in which the position could be turned round and we'd create a much happier country than we have today.
All right, I think that's it. Vince Cable, thanks very much for joining King's Politics. You were our first guest, and yeah, it was great to have you on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks everyone for coming as well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.